In New Mexico, USA, an outpost built on deception and lies.
People came to make their fortune, but what they found was betrayal, violence, and retribution.
An institution in Scotland that started a medical revolution.
These buildings represent a real turning point in the history of medicine.
A factory in Germany that gave the world a popular product.
Some people called it white gold because it was so valuable.
And in Iraq, a lost city, the former home of two tyrants.
It was clearly the site of a famous ruler, but it's not the person you really think it's going to be.
Decaying relics, shadows of lost worlds, ruins haunted by the past, their secrets waiting to be revealed. Between Edinburgh and Glasgow in central Scotland, an imposing ruin casts a long shadow.
This epic building rising out of the woodland, which is totally roofless.
Very imposing, made of stone, designed almost like a giant church with two clock or bell towers. But they're totally dilapidated. Everything is just collapsed into chaos inside.
There is so much feeling of disaster here that you can't help but think that this is a dangerous place.
There are clues here about a terrifying past.
So you used to find the old wheelchairs, an electric shock box, we found straitjackets, found probes as well.
Here in Lanarkshire, people viewed this place as frightening, as an object of suspicion, and it was a threat.
Hartwood was like the place that everybody was scared of when we were younger.
Lorraine Duncan grew up in the shadow of this spooky place.
It was a place that we associated with the boogeyman, as we called it, a place that you were threatened with to go to if you were misbehaved or if you were just naughty with your mum and dad.
People could get locked up here against their will and be in that grim, forbidding place for the rest of their lives.
This complex was Hartwood Hospital, a psychiatric asylum that served Lanarkshire in Scotland for a century.
It's notorious, yeah. There's quite a few asylums in Lanarkshire, but this is one of the biggest.
In the 1950s, it was one of the largest mental institutions in Europe, with over 2,500 patients.
By this time, it had developed a fearsome reputation, forged since its opening in the late 19th century. When the building of this impressive place began in 1890, it was designed to accommodate 420 patients.
The main building had this elegant look, almost like a large cathedral with two beautiful clock towers.
Wherever you're driving from, you can actually see those towers. So it was basically, look at me, look how good I am.
Overlooking the newly completed asylum was the home of its first superintendent, Dr. Archibald Campbell Clark, an experimental physician who pushed boundaries.
Where we're just now is at Campbell Clark's house, so this was the very first building to be built in the Hartwood estate. The work started in January 1890. This was basically Campbell Clark's empire, so that he could actually look out to Hartwood that side and look out to all the surrounding grounds.
Campbell Clark brought groundbreaking ideas in mental health to Hartwood.
These buildings represent a real turning point in the history of medicine.
Way back in the Victorian times, it was very, very brutal asylums. They were called inmates, so that tells you quite a lot about the attitudes towards mental health in asylums.
Dr. Campbell Clark's view is that mental institutions ought to be a place where people would not be restrained, they wouldn't be held in straitjackets.
Clark thought it was vitally important for patients to live something like a normal life.
The hospital staff members were particularly keen for their patients to share leisure time with one another.
You had the male ward and you had the female ward, and they would come in together into one big main dining room, which is over there. It would hold about 600 people with the big impressive windows. I can always remember the big impressive windows at the front. And then upstairs was what they called the recreational room, which would hold 1,200 people, where they would have the cinemas and the dancing and just have a jolly time in the place.
Dr. Campbell Clark hoped these communal activities would help the hospital achieve its ultimate goal.
His vision was to create this nurturing environment and get them back out into their homes and back into their communities.
One of his more revolutionary ideas was to get the patients to work on the site.
Male patients were put to work as tailors, shoemakers, bakers, gardeners, whereas the women were put to work in the kitchen and generally doing the housework around the ward.
Today we call this occupational therapy, and working folding sheets or in the kitchen or tending vegetables might not sound that exciting, but for a patient who might otherwise be sitting in a room staring at the walls, this was something that was very healthy.
Eventually, Hartwood became less reliant on the outside world.
In time, Hartwood Hospital was almost entirely self-sustaining.
The compound had gardens for growing food. It had a small cemetery, various workshops.
It even had its own railway station, a branch line from the Caledonian Railway, Scotland's major 19th century train network.
So this here is part of the railway line, and it was used to bring in the coal and the supplies, and it would come into the kitchens and the sculleries, and that was about this area here. It would bring in coal, which is about 9 shillings a tonne at the time, but that's what powered Hartwood and created the generation and the heat and the hot water.
This was a tiny little boom town built around ideas of mental health.
As part of his radical reforms in mental health, Campbell Clark introduced an overhaul in the training of nurses.
The specialty of psychiatric nursing, to this day, owes some of its origins to this institution and to its visionary director.
So where we are just now is the old nursing home. It was ultimately to be used as a training hospital. This is actually the first time I have been in since 1994. The state of the place and how much has been ruined. It's a shame, it's a loss, a total loss.
Hartwood discharged more patients than any other hospital in the country. But some of the methods used are outlawed today.
When they started demolishing the buildings, things were just like abandoned everywhere. We found straitjackets, found probes as well that would have been used to electric shock people. They would force feed them, they would starve them.
It's safe to say that people in the local community don't believe that the conditions at Hartwood, even under Campbell Clark, were as humane as they appeared on paper.
The standards of the care of the mentally ill in that era were really quite dark.
Campbell Clark trialed experimental new procedures and ended up turning Hartwood into something else entirely.
It is said that Campbell Clark was one of the early doctors to perform lobotomies on his patients.
Viewed as a kind of miracle cure, surgeons drilled 2 holes into the skull, then inserted a sharp spiked instrument into the brain to cut off the frontal lobe.
He was the first man actually to bring the lobotomies to Europe. A lot it was experimental, which they believed that they could actually rewire the brains, and they would basically make them into a vegetable state. and they didn't learn. They would do one and then they would move on to another one until they could actually find a cure, which they never ever did. And what we do in mental health just now, you would never dream of doing anything like that. But what we need to remember is in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that was normal. That was seen as being groundbreaking.
In 1901, Dr. Campbell Clark died of influenza. Some say he was a pioneer in patient care, others that he exploited his position to experiment on vulnerable people. But after his death, the horrors at Hartwood escalated.
The problem is that Dr. Campbell Clark dies a very young man, but people who come after him are not as dedicated to rehabilitation and to occupational therapy.
Over time, the hospital population grew dramatically and the conditions deteriorated.
Hartwood was seen as a horror house, and most disturbing of all, anyone could find themselves here.
1927, you could actually just drive up here and dump your wife off at the gate, pay the £5 and away you go. The reasons that you were put into Hartwood would turn your stomach nowadays.
You could be committed for getting pregnant because you couldn't hold down a job, or you could be sent to an institution because your relatives didn't like you.
We've found people who were epileptic. We've got kids who were poor in youth. We were put into Hartwood, and it's totally mind-blowing. Being drunk, that was another one we found. 24-year-old woman who had been wandering the streets, and the police actually brought her here, and she outlived her life in Hartwood.
By the end of the 20th century, reforms in legislation spelt the beginning of the end for Hartwood.
By the late 20th century, the standards of care for the mentally ill had changed a lot. The Community Care Act was an effort to shut down the old asylums and distribute patients in smaller facilities or in their own communities with some kind of support system. That was the end of the line for Hartwood and other large asylums of that type.
The hospital closed in 1998. Today, dedicated locals like Lorraine are determined to recognize the forgotten patients and outcasts of Hartwood.
So we're in Hartwood Cemetery. We have got 635 graves and we've got 1,255 people.
Sadly, the hospital's medical and cemetery records were destroyed or are missing, leaving only numbers as a record of those who died.
So now what we're trying to do is dig up all the numbers and give everybody their name back and give them the dignity and the respect that they should be due.
South of Baghdad in Iraq, on an endless desert plain, lie the ruins of a lost city.
This harsh landscape, broken only by the Euphrates, was once home to the greatest city the world had yet seen.
A city that was not just central to the culture and politics of the region, but significant in the entire history of the civilized world. When you first see this site from above, it looks like a labyrinth, not just a hodgepodge of different structures, but an actual maze.
This place is just massive and is surrounded by huge fortified walls.
But not everything in this ruin is ancient.
You can see the kind of classic sort of ruins that you might expect from an old archaeological site with walls sort of crumbling away. But then you turn a corner and there's a wall that looks like it was made a couple of days ago. So you've got this kind of juxtaposition of old and new.
Stories of this place have endured through time, even appearing in the pages of the Bible.
In its time, this was one of the largest cities on the planet.
Tales of its construction and the powerful ruler who built it still echo around the world to this day.
Allegedly, this place was home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but it's never been found, prompting the question, did it even exist?
This is the ancient city of Babylon, the supposed home to a lost wonder.
The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are described as this extraordinary feat of engineering, these layers of lush vegetation fed through a complex system of waterways that by some accounts kind of defy gravity as they rise up out of the desert plain.
But the ancient gardens have disappeared.
The many Greek and Roman accounts of the Hanging Gardens are all second-hand, though archaeologists have searched in vain for the exact location of the Hanging Gardens.
For 2 millennia, people have only been able to guess at the location of the Gardens of Babylon. But in 1902, one man believed he'd found it.
Babylon is very important for me because it's the center of our civilization.
Mohammed Tahir is a scholar of ancient Babylon.
When we were children, my father used to bring us to visit. He insisted to learn us to love the heritage, our heritage.
The heritage here goes back more than 2,000 years. Part of that history is written on the walls.
Here we have the original stone. It is limestone in about 605 BC. All these are original writing, and here, this is the name of Nebuchadnezzar II.
Nebuchadnezzar II was king of Babylonia. He claimed to be descended from fabled rulers. But his reign saw him build a legend of his own.
Nebuchadnezzar II is known as the greatest king of the New Babylonian Empire. He ruled over much of what is today the Middle East from 604 to 562 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar had an interesting strategy to ensure that his name would live on into posterity. He had it carved into many of the bricks.
His greatest legacies are the surviving structures of the ancient city of Babylon, the place where he built his capital.
He rebuilt Babylon trying to top the previous version. Ancient sources say the city had between 300 and 400 temples.
And to defend his capital city, he built the Ishtar Gate.
Ishtar Gate was one of 9 gates in Babylon. The army of Babylon, they used to stand at the top of Ishtar Gate for protection.
So you can imagine you're allowed through the Ishtar Gate and you're presented with this amazing processional way, this artery that runs north-south through the whole of the city. And this would have been used for religious festivals, but also to parade the armies up and down as they went off to fight their adversaries.
But the processional way is not like it once was. Today, the Ishtar Gate in Babylon is a fake.
And this is not original. This is a replica. It is designed by one of Iraqi community in 1958.
Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon has stood for nearly 3,000 years. But its history was changed forever by the emergence of a new tyrant. His name was Saddam Hussein.
Part of his vision was to lead a pan-Arabist empire that would stretch over pretty much the same territory as Nebuchadnezzar's had done centuries earlier.
He kind of models himself on these kings of the past. And what he does with Babylon, instead of preserving it or excavating it even further, he starts to actually build on it.
It's said that Nebuchadnezzar decreed that when his grandsons returned to the city of Babylon, they should rebuild it to its former glory.
So Saddam, he considered himself in his mind, he was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And he followed this advice and he decided to rebuild the palace again.
Saddam built his new monuments on top of ancient Babylon. But when he was deposed, the city was abandoned and its history destroyed.
In my view, the structures that Saddam Hussein built on the site should be removed. Yes, they're of historic relevance, but they are not of global historical significance, the way Babylon is for the entire world.
Areas of Babylon had been lost forever. But one relic might have been hidden in a place where even Saddam couldn't get his hands on it.
In 1899, famous archaeologist Robert Caldervey started a large-scale excavation of the site using comparatively modern techniques.
During the excavations, it was in the northeast corner that they found these chambers and a kind of well, and it was thought that this might be a place where they drew up water to feed the gardens of Babylon.
Robert Caldervey discovered a basement with 14 rooms and stone arches. They appeared to match the description of the hanging gardens in ancient texts.
But it turns out that this sort of theory of the northeast corner being the gardens of Babylon was probably not quite the case, because actually from the architecture and the fact that this area is much lower than the surrounding buildings, it meant that it was probably used as a kind of natural fridge. So the hot air of the desert rising, this area would maintain it a kind of low temperature so you could keep wine in there, in effect almost like the local wine store.
Robert Caldervey left Babylon without ever finding its hanging gardens. Now, after Saddam's interventions, they may never be found at all.
Currently, a large-scale conservation project hopes to train local technicians to help preserve the city and ultimately get it qualified as a World Heritage Site.
My hope for the future, I want to see Babylon as the center of tourism in the world, because Babylon deserves that.
Deep within New Mexico's Chihuahuan Desert, among the rattlesnakes and tumbleweeds, sits a time capsule of America's past.
There's nothing around for miles on end, just mountains and desert.
You're in these dry, barren, rolling hills, and then here's this little cluster of very plain, simple, old buildings.
There's this dusty main street that runs through the center of the town. You can imagine that there were probably lots of people here before, but now everything is empty. Everyone is gone.
Strewn with trinkets from a bygone era, it feels like it's only a matter of time before everything here is swallowed up by the desert.
There are broken windows and rotting timbers and even rusty wagons.
The paint is peeled off the walls. There's not much left in the way of furniture.
Signs of a violent past recall a time when this part of America was beyond the reach of the law.
A noose hangs eerily from one of the ceilings. I'm not sure this is a town I would have liked to have spent much time in.
This really was the Wild West. It was a lawless frontier, and one wrong step and you could be shot or hanged.
People came to make their fortune, but what they found was betrayal, violence, and retribution.
Local resident Dave Oschenbein knows firsthand the difficulties of living in such a harsh environment.
This is very hot, dry climate out here, and the ground is very hard and rocky. So this would have been a pretty tough place to live. People take it for granted how easy we actually have it in day-to-day life.
It's a really harsh climate and environment, but if there was such a thriving town here, then there was something that made that worthwhile.
Anytime you see man-made structures in this kind of barren environment, you have to ask yourself, what brought people here? Why would they build something in this godforsaken place?
This town first made its name by mining the region's rich silver deposits. But by 1871, there were rumors that something far more valuable had been discovered here: diamonds.
This was huge. So miners come flooding in, and back come the bars and the brothels and the people and the troublemakers. this time thinking they're going to get rich on diamonds.
But diamonds were just the newest of the underground discoveries in the region. Another was made when this place was a water stop in the middle of the New Mexico desert.
This little spot had been used by native peoples for many centuries. There's a small water source here, which is always important in the desert.
So this Army mail station was the first building on the property because of that small spring. Constructed by the Army in 1856, they could water their horses up while delivering orders between forts.
So really, in the beginning, this was just a stopping point. There was no real reason for people to actually live here. That is, until an incredible discovery was made.
In 1870, prospectors discovered silver deposits in the area.
Almost overnight, people started moving to this town and wanting to open up mining claims. But to really develop the mines, they needed some serious investment money.
With global demand for silver on the rise, one veteran of the California gold rush stepped in to stake his claim.
The big money came from a guy named William Ralston. He was the head of the Bank of California and one of the most influential business people in the West at that time.
With William Ralston's financing, the town grew pretty quickly. You know, there'd be 3,000 miners here during the first boom, and there would have been 150 to 200 structures here at that point.
But with so much money to be made and so far away from civilized America, maintaining the rule of law was not an easy business.
This was a very harsh, rough town during its peak. 160 years ago, you would have seen many saloons along this street. And with miners going in and out of the different saloons, they traveled in packs during that time for protection.
So all the old movies you've seen of dangerous desert cowboy towns, that's really what this was kind of like.
There was no law enforcement here, you know, except for the one agreed upon rule that if you killed someone, you had to bury them.
Ralston was keen to protect his investments, and so he employed a group of hired guns from Texas.
In fact, as they began to develop this town, they named it Ralston after the banker. He had never been there, but the town carried his name regardless. It was a little bit like somebody might name a town Morgan Stanley today or something.
A banker's name was a stamp of quality, but a scandal was about to hit the town.
In 1871, a rumor got out that diamonds were found on one of Ralston's properties at Lee's Peak, which was not too far outside of the town of Ralston.
Ralston was a big investor in the diamond fields that were in Lee's Peak out here.
And with so much at stake, Ralston was forced to recruit outlaws to protect his interests.
The hired guns were to keep people away from the mines. Guys like Curly Bill Brocious and Sandy King would have been a couple of the cowboys that Ralston had patrolling the different hills here, keeping people away from the mines.
There was a lot of tension between the miners and Ralston's thugs. There were many rumors of fighting, and at one point it almost came to all-out war.
The discovery of diamonds looked set to put this frontier town on the map, which it did, but for the wrong reasons.
The great American geologist Clarence King was asked to come in and look into this claim that there was a huge diamond discovery in the West. It all turned out to be a scam.
In reality, two prospectors planted diamonds and other precious gems in a remote spot in a bid to con Ralston and other investors to buying the land off them. They'd actually bought South African rough diamonds in England and brought them back over to America.
Ralston's company collapsed, and by late 1873, the town reverted to pretty much a desolate stagecoach stop. Ralston died about 2 years later. Some people believe it was by suicide, but that's not actually where the story of this town stops.
In 1879, English mining engineer William G. Boyle acquired the dormant silver claims. Boyle's investment breathed new life into the area and sparked a second boom period.
Boyle's first move was to get rid of the name Ralston and replace it with someone who was more widely revered, William Shakespeare.
Boyle tried to erase the past with this new name and clean up the town's tarnished reputation. But some old habits die hard.
Shakespeare had 3 saloons, it had 2 blacksmiths, 2 hotels, a meat market, a mercantile shop, and a lawyer. But that doesn't mean the law had come to town.
This was the stagecoach station, and this front room would have been the dining room, and you would have had passengers stopping here. As you can see, this not only served as a dining room, it also served as the hanging room as well. The lack of tall trees in the area, you needed a place to stretch someone's neck, and this became the room.
In 1881, 2 Wild West outlaws met their ends here. One of the men, Sandy King, was a hired gun from the Ralston era.
On one occasion, Sandy King got into an altercation with a local storekeeper, and King actually pulled out his gun and ended up shooting the storekeeper's finger off. So King was promptly arrested. At about the same time, William Tattenbaum, a friend of King's who was more commonly known as Russian Bill, was also arrested for cattle rustling.
Local militia here would get together, and they'd already decided they were going to hang Russian Bill, and they figured they might as well just hang Sandy at the same time. That way they only have to dig the one hole.
On the afternoon of November the 9th, 1881, Sandy King and Russian Bill were hanged by the neck until they were dead.
This would be a terrible place to be hung. This wouldn't be a drop you and break your neck. This would be a pull you up and tie you off. The local militia would just stand around and wait until the 2 men quit kicking. Then these guys all went back to their homes.
Not long after the execution of the 2 outlaws, Shakespeare became a ghost town once again.
When the Southern Pacific Railroad Company completed their line, they actually bypassed the town by 3 miles. And so once that happened, everyone moved to Lordsburg, which was the town that was closest to the tracks.
Today, preserving Shakespeare means a battle against the elements. It's being fought by Dave and his family.
Well, it's very important to me because of the family connection, because they spent so many years here trying to keep this town going and trying to keep this preserved for people to come and enjoy.
Towns like this give us a lens through which to look at our history, and they give us an insight into these little towns that made up the Wild West, the lawless West, from which our country grew out of.
In Germany is the birthplace of an item found in every home.
Outside, the place has the feeling maybe of a hospital or a sanatorium. But inside, you're confronted with the fragile remains of something very different.
This building isn't watertight. If it rains outside, it's raining inside.
When you look at these machines and all of the industrial investment in this place, it's easy to imagine hardworking people coming here to earn their living, everything here clicking and whirring along day after day. Why did they stop?
This is a huge complex, and there's something new to explore around every corner. There's machines, there's old files and documents, but you also start to feel a bit uneasy. Why is it that every now and again something crunches delicately underfoot?
When this place was built, Germany was a world leader in a fine craft.
Was fasziniert mich am meisten an diesem Ort? dass so viel Designgeschichte in dieser ruhigen, abgelegenen bayerischen Ort entstehen könnte.
Tim Morris is dedicated to preserving its heritage.
Seit 1887 war hier erst Industrie, vor allem Exportgeschichte geschrieben. Und dann ab 1913.
In every corner are the fragile leftovers of what was made here. Fine, crafted porcelain.
Shelves upon shelves of porcelain line the walls, and so you almost instinctively feel like you need to watch your step and be careful, but this building has already been ravaged.
This is the Artsberg factory. It's one of many porcelain plants in Germany. But this place had a secret recipe.
Porcelain is said to date back about 2,000 years, and some of the earliest sites of production are in China. It was used to make teacups and plates, but also decorative items like intricate statues.
Some people called it white gold because it was so valuable. And only the Chinese knew how to make porcelain.
The exact combination of materials to produce porcelain can vary, but there is one material that is necessary, and that is kaolin, or China clay.
But at the start of the 18th century, China's secret was uncovered.
One German engineer discovers the right temperature and just the right additives. And suddenly, anybody can make porcelain.
With the secret out, China's monopoly was over. Now white gold could be made on the European continent.
So German porcelain coming from Bavaria can be sold all over Europe as an alternative to the porcelain coming from China.
With German porcelain in great demand, in 1887, a factory was built in the town of Artsberg.
Wir befinden uns in die älteste noch erhaltene Teil der ehemaligen.
It was under the management of a man named Lehmann.
Theodor Lehmann is a German son of a porcelain potter who becomes a porcelain industrial baron. He turns the business from a craft into an industrial process.
Wir wissen, dass Theodor Lehmann eine Wohnung auf dem Betriebsgelände gehabt hatte, aber nicht genau, wo es war. Man kann sich fast vorstellen, wie hier vielleicht stand, ein Kaffeetrank.
At this time, German products were dominating markets. And so Great Britain actually passed the Merchandise Mark Act, which would require that any product that was produced in Germany had to have a stamp or a seal that essentially said that it was made in Germany. And the hope was that this would deter people from buying them, but it ends up becoming the sort of seal of approval or a seal of quality.
But one man believed that Lehmann was selling a poor product.
Hermann Gretsch comes up to Lehmann and he says, that shape of pot is useless. Your soup tureen is shaped so that you can never get the last bit of soup out of the bowl with a ladle. And the answer is, well, could you do any better? And Gretsch says, well, I happen to be a pottery designer and I can do better.
Gretsch was hired to design a new product with modern appeal and an ergonomic shape he called Form 1382.
And it is an entire set of tableware that's designed to look harmonious together. And it becomes the classic German middle-class tableware.
The fact that you could buy individual pieces to make your own set kind of democratized porcelain. It made it something that everyday people could buy, and it was no longer something just for the elite.
Form 1382 could be found in modest European homes or on the grand tables of world leaders.
Gretsch is really German, so his designs become the standard German pottery designs. And everyone in Germany, maybe even Hitler, has got Arnsberg china right there on their dinner tables.
Während des Zweiten Weltkriegs ging die Produktion weiter, allerdings zunehmend auf Sparflamme. Es ist bekannt, dass später Zwangsarbeiter hier auch einmal eingesetzt waren. Es kam mit Rohstofflieferschwierigkeiten zu Produktionsausfällen. Die Fabrik war gegen Kriegsende auch von der alliierten Bombe auch mal getroffen. Ich mache das komplette Ding nochmal, das war eine...
But all this devastation had an unexpected consequence for the porcelain factory. In the years after the war, ordinary people rushed to replace all the belongings that had been destroyed in the course of the war. And if not for that devastation and loss, the 50s and 60s wouldn't have been such a booming time for business. So people literally stood online to buy porcelain. It wasn't a commodity of the elite anymore. It was something that every household needed.
Form 1382 transformed the fortunes of German porcelain. But the Golden Age didn't last forever.
After the Second World War, Japanese manufacturers start to take over global markets. And Japanese makers are able to compete globally for exactly the same buyers. And German porcelain makers who can't compete have to merge.
Die Hauptproduktion von Arnsberg Porzellan ging nach einem Besitzerwechsel 2000 nach Schönding. Danach hat man hier Flachwaren, zum Beispiel Teller, für mehrere hier in die Riegen angesiedelte Porzellanfirmen produziert. Es hat sich aber leider nicht rentiert und 2002 war dann mit 115 Jahren Industrie- und Designgeschichte an dieser Standort endgültig Schluss.
Today, the Arnsberg factory remains frozen in time.
Not much remains from the proud days of Hermann Gretsch, except shelf after shelf bending under the weight of this porcelain. It's still pristine after all this time, which is a real testament to the durability of this amazing product.